Chapter 14. Merle stood on the ferry gaping. Linus leaned out the open window from the front passenger seat. "Are you going to lower the gate?" Merle didn't move. "Useless man," Linus muttered. "I don't know why we're supposed to trust him in charge of a large boat. I'm surprised he hasn't killed anyone yet." "Are we going to crash and sink in the ocean and maybe die?" Chauncey asked. "That would be neat." Linus sighed. He really needed to learn to censor himself better. He turned around to look in the back of the van. 6 children stared at him with varying degrees of interest at the idea of sinking in the ocean and dying. Lucy and Chauncey more so than others. Zoe, sitting in the third row, arched an eyebrow at him, indicating without so much as a single word that this was his mess and he might as well own up to it. He hoped he wouldn't live to regret this. Chances were pretty high he would. "We're not going to sink into the ocean and die," Linus said as patiently as possible. "It's merely an expression used by adults, and therefore children such as yourselves shouldn't say anything like it." Arthur snorted from the driver's seat, but Linus ignored him. He was on very strange ground with Arthur since the night in his bedroom, where once he'd had no problem in speaking his mind to the master of the house. He now found himself blushing and sputtering as if he were a schoolboy. It was ridiculous. Do adults think about death a lot?" Lucy asked. He cocked his head at an odd angle. "That must mean I'm an adult too, because I think about it all the time. I like dead things. I would still like you if you were dead, Mr. Baker, maybe even more." Zoe smothered a laugh with the back of her hand and turned to look out the window. Useless. Her and Arthur both. "Adults don't think about death a lot," Linus said sternly. "In fact, they barely think about it at all. Why, it doesn't even cross my mind." "Then why are so many books written by adults about mortality?" Fee asked. It's because that's neither here nor there. What I'm trying to say is that there is no more talk about death or dying. Talia nodded sagely as she stroked her beard. "Exactly, because it's better not to know if we're about to die. That way we don't start screaming right now. It'll be a surprise. We can always scream then." Theodore chirped worriedly, hiding his head under his wing as he sat on Sal's lap. Sal reached down and stroked his back. I can tell you when you're going to die," Lucy said. He leaned his head back and stared at the ceiling of the van. "I think I could see the future if I tried hard enough. Mr. Baker, do you want me to see when you're going to die?" "Ooh, yes, it's coming to me now. I can see it. You're going to perish in a terrible—" "I don't," Linus snapped, "and I will tell you again. While we're in the village, you can't go around offering to tell people about what fate awaits them." Lucy sighed. "How am I supposed to make new friends if I can't tell them about how they'll die? What's the point?" "Ice cream and records," Arthur said. "Oh, okay." This was a very bad idea. "Do you think I look good?" Chauncey asked for what had to be the 100th time. "I don't know if I got my outfit quite right." He wore a tiny trench coat and a top hat was set between his eyes. He said it was his disguise, but it did little. It had been his idea, and Linus hadn't felt like arguing, especially when Chauncey had exclaimed quite loudly that he couldn't go into the village nude, even though that was how he spent most of his time on the island. Linus had never thought about it that way, and now he couldn't not. "You look fine," Linus said, "dashing even." "Like a spy in the shadows about to reveal a big secret," Sal told him. "Or like he's going to open his coat and flash us," Talia muttered. "Hey, I wouldn't do that. Only if you asked." Zoe was no longer trying to hide her laughter. Linus turned back around in the seat, staring out the window. Merle was still gaping at them. "Second thoughts?" Arthur asked. Linus didn't even have to look at him to know he was smiling. "No," Linus said, "of course not. This is going to be fine. This is going to—" "Good God, man, lower the dang gate!" "Ooh," the children said. Mr. Baker cursed. Talia whispered in awe. It was going to be fine. "We'll be back later this afternoon," Arthur said to Merle as they exited the ferry. "I do hope that won't be a problem. I'll make sure there's something a little extra in it for you." Merle nodded, still slack-jawed. That's fine, Mr. Parnassus." "I assumed it would be. It's good to see you again." Merle fled back to the ferry. "Odd fellow, isn't he?" Arthur asked. He drove toward the village. As it was toward the end of September, and therefore the beginning of the off season, the village of Marsyas wasn't as bustling as it normally was. Even when Linus had arrived 3 weeks prior, there were still crowds on the sidewalks peering into the shops, or children in swimsuits following their parents who wore flip flops on their pasty feet, carrying umbrellas and towels and coolers as they headed toward the beach. The town wasn't dead exactly, but quiet, which put Linus at ease. He wanted this to go as smoothly as possible so they could do it again after he left. The fact that he was thinking in terms of the orphanage remaining as it was never really crossed his mind. That would come later. But those who were on the streets didn't do much to hide the fact that they were gawking. Talia, nearest to the window, waved as they drove by a woman and her 2 children. The children waved back. The mother grabbed them and held them as close as if she thought they were about to be snatched. Chauncey, who sat on the opposite end of the bench, plastered his face against the window, eyes darting around. "There's the hotel. I see it. Look at it. Look at... Oh, my God. There's a bellhop, a real live bellhop. Look, look!" And there was a thin man helping an elderly woman wearing an inordinate amount of fur from an expensive car. They heard Chauncey's unholy screech, and Linus looked back in time to see Chauncey press his mouth against the glass and blow out a large puff of air, causing his head to expand. The old woman staggered, hand going to her throat. The bellhop managed to catch her before she fell. "Wow," Chauncey breathed as he peeled his face from the glass. "Bellhops can do everything." It was going to be fine. It was. Arthur pulled into a car lot reserved for those headed to the beach. Since it was the off season, it was mostly empty and there was no one in the pay booth, which had been shuttered. He pulled into the first free space and turned off the van. "Children," he said mildly, "please exit the vehicle and buddy up." A herd of charging, heavily pregnant rhinoceroses could have been quieter than the children were at that moment. Linus gripped the report in his lap as the van rocked back and forth. The third report was sealed in the envelope, as it always was, stamped and addressed to extremely upper management, care of the department in charge of magical youth. He thought about going to the post office first, but figured it would be best to wait until they were finished. No need for distractions. He set it on the dashboard. "All right?" Arthur asked quietly. Linus glanced at him before remembering how their hands felt together and looked away again. Such frivolous thoughts. "I'm fine," he said gruffly. "Everything is fine." "I believe that's your mantra for today. You've said it enough." "Yes, well, the more I say it, perhaps the more it will be true." Arthur reached out and touched his shoulder briefly. "The children will be on their best behavior." "It's not them I'm worried about," Linus admitted. "I distinctly remember a man who proclaimed he wouldn't stand for rudeness. Quite the fierce sight he made. I was impressed." "You should probably get out more if that impressed you." Arthur laughed. "You are delightful. And just look, I'm out here. Now, let's see what we shall. We can't stay in the van forever." No, they couldn't, even if Linus wanted to. He was being silly, but he couldn't curb the strange twist of dread in the pit of his stomach. This had been his idea, one he'd pushed for. But now that they were there, he looked out the windshield. On the side of the building in front of them, under an advertisement for Chunky Cola, "We have all the chunks," there was a banner reminding people to see something, say something. "You have their identification papers?" Linus asked quietly. "I do." "Okay." Linus opened the door and stepped out of the van. The children had lined up in pairs at the rear. Lucy and Talia, Sal and Theodore, Fee and Chauncey. They had come up with their buddies on their own, and while Linus had figured Sal and Theodore would be together, the idea of Lucy and Talia was enough to send shivers down his spine. They tended to feed off each other. He'd had to tell Talia in no uncertain terms that she could not bring her shovel, much to her displeasure, which was why he was startled when Arthur said, "Fee and Chauncey, you're with Miss Chapelwhite. Sal and Theodore, you're with me. Lucy and Talia, you are assigned to Mr. Baker." Lucy and Talia turned their heads slowly in unison, matching smiles on their faces that sent a cold chill down Linus's spine. He sputtered, "Perhaps we should, there's really no need for, I think we should, Oh dear. What's the matter, Mr. Baker? Lucy asked sweetly. Yes, Mr. Baker, Talia asked. What's the matter? I'm fine, he said. Everything is fine, though I think it would be a good idea if we all stick together. As much as we can, Arthur said easily. His slacks were too short for his legs again. His socks were purple. Linus was doomed. Though I think most of them will get bored inside the record store, and who better to help Lucy choose the music than you? Children, did you remember your allowances? All of them nodded, except for Chauncey, who wailed, No, I forgot. I was too busy getting dressed. Now I'm broke and I have nothing. Luckily for you, I figured that to be the case, Arthur said, which is why I gave yours to Zoe. Chauncey immediately calmed, looking up at Arthur in adoration. Arthur looked down at his watch. If we end up going our separate ways, plan on meeting up at the ice cream parlor at 2:30. Agreed? Everyone agreed. Then let's go, Arthur said cheerfully. Lucy and Talia immediately reached up and took Linus's hands. Do you think there's a graveyard here, Mr. Baker? Lucy asked. I would like to see it if there is. I told you I should have brought my shovel, Talia muttered. How am I supposed to dig up dead bodies without my shovel? Perhaps Linus was going to live to regret this after all. As much as Linus tried to avoid it, they managed to separate from the group after approximately 3 minutes and 26 seconds. Linus wasn't quite sure how it happened. One moment they were all together, and the next, Talia grunted something in Gnomish that seemed to express extreme happiness, and they were pulled into a store, bell chiming overhead as the door closed behind them. What? Linus asked, glancing over his shoulder to see the others continuing down the street. Arthur winked at him before continuing on. Wait, maybe we should... But Talia wasn't to be deterred. She pulled from Linus's grasp and marched forward, muttering to herself in Gnomish. Oh no, Lucy moaned. Of all the places we could have gone into, she picked the worst. Linus blinked. They were in a hardware store. And Talia was pacing in front of a display of gardening equipment, stroking her beard and inspecting each trowel and spade and forecoat. She stopped and gasped. These are the new BL Max. I didn't even know they were out yet. She reached out and pulled a queerly shaped spade from the display, the handle adorned with imprints of flowers. She turned and showed it to Linus. These are the top-rated spades in Garden Tools Monthly. I didn't think they were going to be released until next spring. Do you know what this means? Linus had no idea. Yes? Talia nodded furiously. Exactly. Just think, I can buy this, and we can go to the graveyard like Lucy wanted. I can dig up so many things with this. Don't say that so loudly, Linus hissed at her, but she ignored him, proceeding to mime, digging as if getting used to the grip and heft of the spade. Even Lucy seemed interested. It's a little small, he said doubtfully. How are you going to dig up an entire grave with that little thing? It's not about the size, Talia scoffed, but what you do with it. Isn't that right, Mr. Baker? Linus coughed. That's quite right, I suppose. And I'm a gnome, Lucy. You know how well I can dig. Lucy nodded, looking relieved. Good, because we might have to dig up at least 3 or 4 bodies. We are not digging up any bodies, Linus snapped, so get that idea out of your heads right now. We're not? Talia asked, looking down at the spade. But then what's the point? The point? The point of what? Going to the graveyard, Lucy said, tugging on his hand. We're not going to the graveyard. Talia squinted up at him. But you said we could. Oh no, Lucy moaned. Is he going senile? He's so old he's losing his mind. Help. Please, someone help us. This man who's supposed to be watching us is going senile, and I worry what he might do. A squat woman appeared down one of the aisles looking worried, a smudge of dirt on her forehead, gardening gloves on her hands. She held a pair of running shears. My goodness, what's going on? Are you all right? She stopped when she saw Talia with the spade. She looked over to Lucy, who grinned at her, showing many teeth. She took a step back. You're from the island. Yes, Talia said in a no-nonsense voice, and I'd like to talk to you about the BL Max. When did they come in? Are they as good as their rating suggests? They seem to be lighter than I expected. We're going to the graveyard, Lucy said in an ominous monotone. Do a lot of people die there? I hope so. The woman's eyes widened. "We're not," Linus said hastily. "Talia here has the most beautiful garden that is well cared for. Why, I don't know that I've ever seen anything so immaculate." It didn't appear to do much to calm the woman, though Talia preened. "Thank you, Mr. Baker." She looked back at the woman. "You can't tell by the way he dresses, but sometimes Mr. Baker has good taste." The woman nodded, head jerking up and down. "That's nice," she cleared her throat. "A garden, you say, on the island. I thought it was—" She blanched. Talia cocked her head. "You thought it was what?" It doesn't matter." She glanced quickly at Linus before very obviously forcing a smile on her face. "Tell me about your garden, and I'll see if I can figure out what would be right for you." "Oh, no," Lucy groaned. "Now she'll never stop talking." Talia ignored him as she launched into a very thorough explanation of her garden. In fact, it was so thorough, Linus thought she was going over it inch by inch. And while he secretly agreed with Lucy, he remained focused on the shopkeeper, watching for any sign that she was humoring Talia in order to get them to leave. Though that certainly seemed to be the case at the beginning, the woman began to relax and interrupted Talia, asking questions about pH levels in the soils and what kinds of flowers and plants she grew. The woman seemed impressed with Talia's knowledge and what she had created. Eventually, she said, "While the BL Max are considered top end, I found they tend to wear down quicker. Someone like you," she coughed, "who knows what they're doing might do better with the Fox Fares. They're sturdier and don't cost quite as much. It's what I use here in the shop and at home." Talia put the spade back on the shelf almost reverently. "Fox Fares. Garden Tools Monthly said they—" "Garden Tools Monthly," the woman scoffed. "Oh, my dear child, Garden Tools Monthly is now the Garden Tools Weekly of the garden tool world. It's all about the Garden Tools Bi-Monthly. It's what all serious gardeners read." Talia gasped. "It is?" She stared up at Linus. "Why didn't I know this? What else has been kept from me?" Linus shrugged helplessly. "I have no idea what's going on." The woman squinted at him. "Are you all right, sir? Are you senile?" Linus sighed as Lucy cackled. The total after being run up was astounding. Linus had never spent so much on gardening tools in his life. Talia smiled up at the woman. "Can you excuse me for a moment?" The woman nodded. Talia turned away from her, smile disappearing. She looked frantic. She grabbed Linus's hand and tugged on it, pulling him down. "I don't have enough," she whispered, "and we can't push her down and steal it, right? Because that's wrong." "We absolutely cannot push her down and steal it," Linus said. Lucy rolled his eyes. "I knew you were going to say that." He frowned and then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a handful of crumpled bills. He held it out to Talia. "Is that enough, you think?" Talia shook her head. "No, Lucy, you can't. Those are for your records." Lucy shrugged. "I know, but not all of them are broken. And the ones that did break were my fault anyway. You can have it." "Put your money away," Linus said quietly, "both of you." "But my tools!" He stepped forward to the counter, dropping their hands as he pulled out his own wallet. He smiled weakly at the woman as he handed her his Diners Club card, something he only used in emergencies. She placed it on top of the imprinter and snapped the handle over the receipt. He heard whispering behind him and glanced back, wanting to make sure that they weren't actually planning on robbing the garden store. Instead, he found Talia smiling, her eyes wet, as Lucy wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The woman cleared her throat, and Linus turned back around. She handed him his card and started to bag up the tools. Linus felt Talia step beside him, reaching up to the counter, waving her hands as she couldn't quite see over it. The woman handed her the bags. She hesitated then. "This garden of yours, it sounds lovely." "It is," Talia replied without a trace of ego. "Would it? I like to take pictures of the gardens here in Marsyas." She pointed toward a corkboard on the wall with photographs of different gardens. "From the people who shop here. Every garden is different, I think. They reflect the personalities of those who care for them." "There are no dead bodies in our garden," Lucy said helpfully. "But other than that, it's pretty much exactly like Talia." "That's good to hear," the woman said faintly. She shook her head. "Perhaps, if it's all right with your Mr. Baker here, perhaps I could come out and see your garden one day, in the spring when things are blooming, or sooner if that would be all right. Yes, Talia said, eyes sparkling. Oh, yes, except it wouldn't be Mr. Baker. You'll need to ask Arthur. But I'm sure he'll be okay with it. Mr. Baker is here to make sure we aren't starving or getting beaten or being kept in cages. He goes home soon. Linus turned his head toward the ceiling, asking for guidance. Oh, the woman said. That's good. Lucy nodded. So good, but Mr. Baker isn't all bad. I mean, sure, I tried to scare him off the island when he first arrived, but now I like that he's alive and not the other way. Linus sighed. Wonderful, the woman said weakly. Lovely to hear. I'll send word to Arthur when I can make the trip. Talia gave her dazzling smile. I hope you're prepared to be amazed. My garden makes all those ones on your picture wall look like crap. It was time to go. Thank you, Linus said stiffly as he grabbed the children by the arms and began to pull them from the store. Bye, plant lady, Lucy screeched. See you real soon. They were outside back in the sunlight when Linus was able to breathe again. But before he could speak his mind, he was surprised when his right leg was wrapped tightly in a hug. He looked down to find Talia holding on to him. Thank you, Mr. Baker, she said quietly. That was very nice of you. He hesitated, but then reached down and patted the top of her head through her cap, something he wouldn't have dared to do even a few days ago. Think nothing of it. He's so wonderful and generous, Lucy said, spinning in a circle on the sidewalk, arms outstretched for a reason Linus didn't understand. And I hope he remembers to do the same for me, so I don't have to spend my money and feel left out and have to open a pit to hell and watch this village be swallowed whole, because that would just be so easy. Linus barely had time to wonder why Lucy's threats didn't scare him as much as they once had before they were on their way. Far out, the man in the record store breathed, eyes glazed and bloodshot. He had long hair that fell on his shoulders, and he looked as if he could use a bath, which meant, of course, that Lucy was entranced. Far out, he agreed. He'd managed to climb onto the countertop and was sitting in front of the man. Call me J-Bone, can you dig? On his knees. There was another man in the back of the store watching them warily. You're like... J-Bone made an explosion noise, spreading his hands wide. Yes, Lucy said, that's me. Boom. J-Bone, Linus distrusted him immediately for having such a name, honestly. Looked down at Talia, who was sitting on the floor of the record store, humming as she inspected each of her new tools. Little dude's got a beard, and she's a lady dude. It's very soft, Linus said. She has all these soaps for it. They smell like flowers and girly stuff. Righteous, J-Bone said. Respect, lady dude. This is a trowel, Talia said. It's mine. Cool. He turned back to Lucy, who was only inches from his face. What can I get you, little dude? I require records, Lucy announced. My others were broken after I had a bad dream about getting eaten by spiders, and I need to replace them. Mr. Baker is going to pay for it, so we can spare no expense. J-Bone nodded. I don't know what you just said, but I heard records, and records I can do. He nodded toward the man standing in the back. Me and Marty can hook you up. You smell funny, Lucy said, leaning forward and sniffing him deeply. Like plants, but not like any that Talia has in her garden. Oh, yeah, J-Bone said. I grow and smoke my own. That's quite enough of that. Linus said, we don't need to know anything about your extracurricular activities. Who's the square? J-Bone whispered. Mr. Baker, Lucy whispered back. He's here to make sure I don't burn anyone alive with the power of my mind and then consume their souls from their smoking carcass. Rock on, little dude, J-Bone said, offering a high five, which Lucy gladly accepted. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen to me, but you do you. He tossed his hair back over his shoulder. What are you looking for? The Big Bopper, Richie Valens, Buddy Holly. Whoa, old school. It keeps the spiders in my head away. I can dig it. You like the king? Lucy scoffed as he bounced on his knees. Do I like the king? Of course I like the king. I think my real dad met him once. Linus chose not to ask a follow-up question to that one. Real dad, huh? J-Bone asked, leaning forward on the counter. Yeah, Lucy's eyes shifted side to side. He's not around. Deadbeat? You could say that. He's got a lot going on. Oh man, I get that. My dad doesn't think I'm going doing anything with my life, you know? Thinks that I should be doing more than the record store. Lucy was scandalized. But the record store is the best place ever, right? He wants me to be a personal injury attorney like him. Lucy pulled a face. My real dad knows a lot of personal injury attorneys. Trust me when I say you'll be better off here. That's what I think. Ever heard of Santo and Johnny? Sleepwalk is my jam, man, Lucy exclaimed, but I don't have that record. You're in luck, because I think I got one copy left in the back. Let's see if we can find it. Lucy jumped off the counter as J-Bone came around. They began to walk toward the back of the store. Yo, Marty, J-Bone said. Got a little dude looking for some golden oldies. Let's see if we can help him out. Righteous, Lucy exclaimed, staring adoringly up at J-Bone. Golden oldies. Marty didn't speak. He just nodded and turned to walk farther into the store. Linus didn't know how far away they were getting from him. He glanced down at Talia. I'm going to make sure they're okay. You all right staying here by yourself? She rolled her eyes. I am 263 years old. I'm sure I'll be fine. Don't leave the store. She ignored him, going back to lovingly tracing her new tools with a finger. Lucy, J-Bone, and Marty were out of sight. Linus followed where they'd gone. Around the corner near the back of the store was a door that had been shut. Linus tried to open it, but found it locked. He frowned and pressed against it again. It didn't budge. From inside came a cry and a loud crash. Linus didn't hesitate. He threw his weight against the door. He heard it crack in its frame. He stepped back and rushed forward, crashing into it with his shoulder. The door burst off its hinges, falling onto the ground. Linus almost stumbled, but managed to catch himself at the last minute. Inside, he found Marty slumped against the far wall. J-Bone stood above him, a disgusted look on his face. Lucy was flipping through records stacked in a crate. What happened? Linus demanded. Lucy looked up at him and shrugged. Oh, we started talking about Jesus and God and that I was an abomination or something. He nodded toward the unconscious Marty. Around his neck, hanging on a chain, was an ornate silver cross. He tried to shove that in my face. Lucy laughed as he shook his head. What does he think I am, a vampire? That's silly. I like crosses. They're just two sticks put together, but they mean so much to so many. I tried making a symbol out of popsicle sticks that I could sell and get rich, but Arthur said it wasn't right. Look, Linus, Chuck Berry, righteous. He crowed in excitement as he pulled a record up from the crate. So not cool, man, J-Bone scolded the unconscious Marty. Like for real, music is for everyone. He nudged Marty's leg. Whoa, total knockout. Little dude, you are hardcore. So hardcore, Lucy agreed. Linus glanced down at Marty again. He was breathing. He'd probably wake up with a headache and nothing more. Linus thought about giving him another bump on the head with a well-placed kick, but his shoulder hurt, and he had exerted enough energy for the time being. Did he hurt you? Lucy looked up from the Chuck Berry record. Why do you sound like that? Like what? Like you're mad. Are you mad at me? Lucy frowned. I didn't do anything, really. He didn't, J-Bone said. Marty is so fired you don't even know. Linus shook his head. I would never be mad at you, not for this. If I sound angry, it's at this man, not you. Oh, because you like me, huh? Yes, God help me, yes, very much so. All of them, really. Something like that. Lucy nodded and went back to the crate. I found 6 I wanted. Can I get 6? 6 it is. He walked over to Lucy to help him carry the records he'd found before he dropped them. They left Marty on the floor and went back to the front of the shop, only to find Talia's bag of tools on the floor, but no Talia. Linus's heart was in his throat. He had turned his back for just a second, and he saw her standing at the front of the store looking out the window. There was a little girl outside on the sidewalk, no more than 5 or 6 years old. She was smiling, her dark hair in twin braids on her shoulders. She put her hand against the window. Talia did the same. Their hands were the same size and matched perfectly. Talia laughed, and the girl smiled. She smiled, that is, until a woman came running up the sidewalk, snatching her away, a horrified look on her face. She held the girl against her, turning the girl's head against her shoulder. She glared at Talia through the glass. How dare you, she snapped. You leave my daughter alone, you freak. Linus stepped forward angrily. Now see here! But the woman spat wetly at the window and then turned and hurried away, the little girl held tightly against her chest. That lady was mean, Lucy whispered to Linus. You want me to throw her against the wall like I did Marty? Would that be righteous? No, Linus said, pulling Lucy along. That would not be righteous. The only time you should do that is if you need to defend yourself or others. She was vicious, but she only used words. Words can hurt too, Lucy told him. I know, but we must pick and choose our fights. Just because someone else acts a certain way doesn't mean we should respond in kind. It's what makes us different. It's what makes us good. Big man is right, J-Bone said, coming up behind them. People suck, but sometimes they should just drown in their own suckage without our help. Linus was positive that wasn't what he meant at all. He wasn't very happy with his new nickname either. Talia was standing at the window still. The woman's spittle dripped down the glass. Talia didn't seem too upset, but he couldn't be sure. She looked surprised when Linus and Lucy appeared beside her. That was weird, huh? She said. She shook her head. People are strange. Are you all right? She shrugged. The girl was nice. She said she liked my beard. It was just the old lady who was a jerk. The woman wasn't. I know what she was or wasn't, Talia said lightly. I've seen it before. It's awful, but it's not anything I haven't dealt with. But it's funny, right? Linus didn't find anything about this to be humorous. What is? That there's so much hope even when it doesn't seem like it. He was gobsmacked. How do you mean? The little girl, she wasn't scared of me. She was nice. She didn't care what I looked like. That means she can make up her own mind. Maybe that woman will tell her I'm bad, and maybe she'll believe it. Or maybe she won't believe it at all. Arthur told me that in order to change the minds of many, you have to first start with the minds of few. She's just one person, but so is the lady. Talia grinned. Can we go to the graveyard now? I want to try out my spade. What did you get, Lucy? Chuck Berry, Lucy said proudly. I also threw Marty against the wall. Cracked the plaster and everything, J-Bone said with a laugh. It was gnarly. Wow, Talia said, suitably impressed. Is he dead? Do we need to bury him? Let me go to get my tools and we can... Nah, he's not dead. I didn't think that would make Mr. Baker too happy, so I let him keep his insides on his insides. Talia sighed. Probably for the best. I really like Chuck Berry. I can't wait to listen to that one. Right? It's so righteous. He looked up at Linus. Can we pay for these now? We can't steal them because J-Bone isn't a square, right? He sounded as if he would still be okay with stealing them regardless. That's right, he's not a square, Linus said, vowing silently to never repeat those words again. You can pay. Nah, J-Bone said, your money's not good here. You get those for free, little dude. Sorry about the whole Marty trying to exorcise you thing. Give me some skin. Lucy did, and gladly. Linus, I get them for free. That's even better than stealing. Linus sighed. I don't know why I even bother. Such a square big man, Lucy muttered, but he knocked his shoulder against Linus's hip as if to show he didn't mean it. At 2:30, they met the others in front of the ice cream parlor. People were giving them a wide berth and staring openly, but none of the children seemed to notice. They were listening to Chauncey, who appeared to be wearing a different hat than he'd had before, who was flailing excitedly while Zoe and Arthur watched him looking amused. There they are, Chauncey exclaimed. Lucy, Talia, you'll never believe what happened. Look what I got. He lifted the hat off his head, stalks stretching excitedly as his eyes rose. In his tentacles, he held a familiar cap that looked like... He gave it to me, Chauncey cried. I didn't have to ask. All I did was tell the bellhop I thought he was the greatest man who ever lived and that when I grew up, I wanted to be just like him. And he gave it to me. Can you believe it? He set it back on his head. How does it look? Quite dashing, Linus said. I almost wish I had a suitcase so I could hand it off to you to carry for me. Chauncey squealed. You mean it? You really think so? It looks good, Lucy said, patting the top of the hat. Maybe we can figure out how to make a matching coat for it. I think I like it better than your other hat, though that other one is good too. Thanks, Lucy. Always at your service. And just what do you have? Arthur asked, squatting down as Talia and Lucy showed him their treasures. Ah, what a lovely spade. And those records, we'll have to listen to them as soon as we get back to the island. Everything all right? Zoe asked quietly while the children were distracted. If you're asking if any felonies were committed, sort of, but nothing I couldn't handle. Anything we need to worry about? Linus shook his head. We'll talk about it more once there aren't so many little ears around. I don't think they need to know what Lucy. I threw a square named Marty against a wall after he tried to exorcise me in a small locked room, and then I got the records for free from J-Bone. Isn't that righteous? Ooh, the rest of the children said. Linus sighed. I think it's time for ice cream.